Welcome to Fifth Quarter Bible and our continuing study of the book of Acts. Today, doing the teaching video for chapters 23 through 25 as we near conclusion to the book of Acts itself. So let's jump into the lesson. As always, the overarching themes in the book of Acts. See if you can remember that title. If you've gone through all these lessons, it should be ringing in your head, right? The acts of the Lord Jesus through his people by the power of the Holy Spirit for the accomplishment of the Father's redemptive and sanctifying purpose. And our themes: the power of the gospel, the transformation of the apostles, the power of the Holy Spirit, emphasis on the resurrection, expansion of the church through persecution, and the fulfillment of the Great Commission. Okay, so as we get ready to start chapter 23 now, very important point. Chapter 23, we really have to go to the end of 22. I don't have it up here on a slide, but if you look at the end of 22, that last verse, okay? On the next day, and remember the next day, Paul had the issue where he got arrested. He's with the Roman tribune who protected him. He gave his speech to the people. They allowed him to, and in Acts chapter 22. But he's under the Roman care right now, being protected from the Jews in Jerusalem who want to kill him. Okay, so that's where we're at. And it says, on the next day, desiring to know the real reason why he was being accused by the Jews, he, that would be the proconsul, unbound him and commanded the chief priests and all the council to meet. And he brought Paul down and sat him before them. So essentially, the Roman tribune calls for a meeting of the Jewish Sanhedrin, kind of an interesting thing. This meeting is going to be, and it's an important point for what we're going to read in a second, be a little bit more informal because this wasn't something planned by the Jews. So he calls them together. That would be Pharisees and Sadducees together. Now the Sanhedrin, we've mentioned it in here, but it's been a while. The Sanhedrin is the ruling council of the Jews, made up of 70 men plus one, made up of two groups, much like we are, Republicans and Democrats in our time today. You have the Pharisees, the more conservative side, the Sadducees, in many ways, at least spiritually speaking, biblically speaking, the more liberal ones. And then you have a high priest who was a Sadducee, because they come from the line of Aaron. And so this ruling council was allowed to operate under the Roman system, like in many parts of the Roman Empire, as long as they did certain things that the Romans wanted them to do. So anyway, they call the Sanhedrin together and they're going to have Paul speak before them. Okay, so we're going to read a little bit of what happens here and then we'll deal with some of the main points. So, looking intently at the council, Paul opens his mouth. Notice what he says. He calls them brothers. They're Jews. He's a Jew. He's a former Pharisee, likely a member of that council, or soon to be a member of that council when his conversion occurred. Brothers, I have lived my life before God in all good conscience up to this day. And the high priest Ananias commanded those who stood by him to strike him on the mouth. So as soon as he opened his mouth, the high priest orders him to be struck. Notice the way Paul responds right away. Then Paul said to him, God is going to strike you, you whitewashed wall. Are you sitting to judge me according to the law, and yet contrary to the law you order me to be struck? So obviously he's upset about being struck, and he speaks out about it. He calls them a whitewashed wall, basically a bunch of hypocrites. They look great on the outside, but inside they are corrupt. Jesus said much of the same. If you go to Matthew chapter 23, where Jesus pronounces woes on the scribes and Pharisees, he uses this term, whitewashed tomb. It's something that looks great and pristine, but it's really a disaster on the inside. Now, there is an interesting thing that happens here in verse 4 and 5. Those who stood by said, would you revile God's high priest? So look what Paul says. I did not know, brothers, that he was the high priest. For it is written, you shall not speak evil of a ruler or your people. So since Paul had left Judaism in a sense and become used by God in the Christian mission field, this is a different high priest. He did not realize this was the high priest. This is an informal meeting. Likely he was not dressed the way a high priest normally would be, and so he couldn't tell that this was the high priest. Now, notice his response. I didn't know, for it is written, you shall not speak evil of a ruler or the people. So he understands the rules and the game. He understands, even though that system is faulty at this point, He understands how things work. And so rather than fight that, he just says, hey, I didn't know he was the high priest. I wouldn't have said that. You're not supposed to say that about the high priest regardless, right? Okay, so at that, already we see an understanding of the system here from Paul, but we're going to get more of an understanding as we continue in this chapter. So as you look at this next part of the chapter, right? Notice it says, now when Paul perceived that one part were Sadducees and the other Pharisees. Now, it says when Paul perceived, I mean, it's almost like when he remembered, right? Like he knows that. Now, who knows, an informal meeting like this, did all the members of the Sanhedrin actually show up to this? Could it be that we had less than the 70 plus 1 people there? We don't know. But at some point in the scriptures, it's important that he perceived that they weren't all together on everything. He understands the division between the Pharisees and the Sadducees and their differences. And so Paul uses something truthful to strike a discord between them, to create division between them so that they would actually end up fighting each other. And he kind of orchestrated this so that he wouldn't have to be before them at this point anymore in this situation. Look what happens, right? Brothers, I am a Pharisee, a son of Pharisees. With respect to the hope and the resurrection of the dead, I am on trial. So he says, look, you know why I'm on trial? Because of the hope and the resurrection of the dead. Notice, the moment he said that, there's dissension between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The Sadducees, right, didn't believe in a resurrection. The Pharisees did acknowledge that. And so a great, such a great clamor here, right? A great uproar arose among the people. Some of them even said, look, we can't find anything wrong with this man. And these are probably many of the Pharisees saying that, while others sharply disagreed and said that he should be, he's not those things, right? He is a danger to the people. Well, in the end result, Paul's plan worked. When the dissension became violent, the tribune, afraid that Paul would be torn to pieces by them, commanded the soldiers to go down, take him away by force, and bring him into the barracks. Okay? So, Paul used what he knew to get himself out of that kind of situation in front of the council. That shows a lot of wisdom. And here, continuing here, the Lord appears to him. Now, this would be the 5th of 6 visions that Paul receives in the book of Acts. And notice what the Lord revealed to him. Look, take courage, for you have to testify the facts to me in Jerusalem and also in Rome. And notice the terminology, you must testify to me in Rome. Ultimately, it was the will of God that took him to Jerusalem when everyone was telling him not to go, and ultimately is going to lead him over to Rome. So again, as we look at the main points from this section, his knowledge of the Sanhedrin is on display. That whole issue with the Pharisees and the Sadducees, particularly over the resurrection. Again, here the resurrection is front and center. It's been a key theme in this book. And here it's a key theme for the same reason, but also because now, it actually practically played into this situation with Paul, where because of this disagreement between these two factions within Judaism at the time, there's a division over this. And it's one of the ways that Paul's able to get away from that dangerous situation. We also see about Paul's vision of going to Rome that ultimately this is the will of God. He's going to end up in Rome because it's God's will for him to end up in Rome. Now, as we look at the rest of this chapter, this section coming up here, there is, starting in verse 12, there's going to be this plot to kill Paul. Now, we're not going to read the entire thing because, again, part of this study is that you've already read this. So we're not reading verse by verse always. But with this conspiracy to sort of ambush Paul as he's being transported the next day, right? Oh, let's have another meeting. Bring him back again. Bring him back, right? We'll behave this time, right? Bring him back. In reality, it's just a plot to kill him. One thing I do want to point out here, it says the chief priests and the elders. Based on the context of what happened before, that day that we just read about, where Paul was removed from that situation and who was upset at Paul primarily there, and the way this is worded, chief priests and elders, it seems as if it strongly indicates that the Pharisees were excluded from this conspiracy. Now, whether or not any of them would have wanted to participate or not in this conspiracy, we'll never know. But this is something that's coming from the Sadducees, okay? the group that does not believe in the resurrection. They're trying to plot his ambush. Paul's nephew hears of it, goes and tells Paul in the prison. Paul sends the nephew to go talk to the tribune, and the tribune ends up deciding to move Paul. Okay, and here's all the text explaining the story. Okay, and ultimately he's going to decide that they are going to transport Paul from where he is and get him into safekeeping with the Roman governor of Judea, a man named Felix. So we can see here, right? Hey, listen, he's going to tell these soldiers, you need to get Paul, you need to get him safely to Felix, the governor. And so that's their mission. They get him out of there. The Romans are protecting Paul. Paul is a Roman citizen. And on top of that, really, God is the one obviously protecting Paul, using these people to protect Paul. Because again, he has his mission, right? He is going to get to Rome to proclaim the gospel to many people there. So Paul is spared. Paul is transported. The Tribune writes a letter to Felix, kind of explaining the situation. Here you can kind of see it, right? There's a letter, and here's the letter kind of explaining what's going on, explaining who Paul is. Okay, and then we get the end of chapter 23. They follow the instructions, right? They got him to where he needed to be, etc. And then we get ready for chapter 24. Before 24, I apologize, right? We had the assassination attempt on Paul. We saw the Jewish hatred and persecution of Paul becoming more murderous, not just hatred and reviling, but actually murderous. And they're going to plot again. If you did all your reading, you know this isn't the only time that this happens. And Paul appears before the Roman governor of Judea. This is part of God's plan to get Paul to Rome. There's going to be a series of events now that is going to lead to Paul being sent to Rome. And that's where chapter 24 comes in. So in chapter 24, we're going to do some of the headlines, or the highlights, I guess we should say, first, and then look at a little bit of it. We have Paul's hearing before the Roman governor of Judea. The actual hearing now is going to be in 24. And then we're going to have these Jewish accusations against Paul. So here's the hearing, right? And after 5 days, the high priest Ananias came down with some elders and spokesmen. They laid down before the governor their case. So all this section here is the Jews laying out their case against Paul. Okay, what their problem is with him, and you know what should be done with him. Right? It's really in the hands of this Roman governor, but the Jews definitely want Paul to be killed. Right? They want to have the ability to do that, or have him killed, or kill them himself, etc. And then as we continue to look, Paul is going to reply. We're going to read some of this reply that Paul gives to the accusations. Paul, you're going to notice Paul in some of the speeches we've already read, and in the speeches coming up, both in this lesson and then in our final lesson, in our final lesson in a few days, we see Paul using these speeches as leverage to proclaim the gospel, while at the same time still defending his innocence in a sense. And Paul was someone who would proclaim the gospel, but also defend himself when necessary. But the gospel always came first, and I think we're able to hear that here. All right, here we go. Verse 10, Paul replied, "Knowing that for many years you have been a judge over this nation, I cheerfully make my defense." So he's being respectful to the governor here. "You can verify that it is not more than 12 days since I went up to worship in Jerusalem, and they did not find me disputing with anyone or stirring up a crowd, either in the temple or in the synagogues or in the city. Listen, why am I even here? I didn't cause any kind of commotion." And the Romans cared about that order. So again, he's being smart how he's laying that out. Verse 13, "Neither can they prove to you what they now bring up against me. But this I confess to you, that according to the way, which they call a sect, I worship the God of our fathers, believing everything laid down by the law and written in the prophets." So in other words, he's like, I worship the God of our fathers, believing everything written in the prophets, but I do that by believing in Jesus and the resurrection, right? Verse 15, "Having a hope in God." So notice that, having a hope in God. That is extremely important, okay? Extremely important. "Having a hope in God, which these men themselves accept, that there will be a resurrection of both the just and the unjust. So I always take pains to have a clear conscience toward both God and man. That's kind of an important point. I always have to take great pains to have a clear conscience both before God and man. Now, after several years, I came to bring also alms to my nation and present offerings. Okay, so again, he's giving his defense here. Okay, he's giving his defense. He's laying out some important gospel messages, right? Having hope in God, believing everything laid out in the law and in the prophets. Remember, the entire scriptures, all the Old Testament, is pointing to Jesus. Now, verse 18. While I was doing this, they found me purified in the temple without a crowd or tumult. Again, emphasizing to the Romans, I wasn't causing any kind of problem. But some Jews from Asia, okay, they ought to be here before you to make an accusation, should they have anything against me. Or else let these men themselves say what wrongdoing they have found when I stood before the council. In other words, what did I do wrong? What did I do wrong at the temple? What did I do wrong on the council that I'm here? I haven't broken any rules or laws or caused any commotion that would make Rome want to step in. And even before that, he's saying, look, I do believe in the scriptures. So he's answering every objection with all of this. Let's see, 21. Other than this one thing that I cried out while standing among them, it is with respect to the resurrection of the dead that I'm on trial before you today. He makes the point, look, the real reason I'm here is because of the resurrection of the dead. That Jesus rose from the dead, and we believe that. And so it seems like even this interaction here is more in conflict with the Sadducees than it is with the Pharisees. Okay, so we have this section of 24 where Paul is giving his defense, and then let's see what is the outcome of that. So Paul's gospel proclamation during his defense, heavily resurrection focused as usual. And then we get this end of the chapter. But Felix, having a rather accurate knowledge of the way, put them off. So he puts off what the people are saying, or he kind of understands Christianity a little bit to some degree, okay, and he's going to end up rendering his final decision. Now here's the thing, there's sort of a two-pronged thing happening here. Paul does find favor with Felix in a sense. He's not just going to turn Paul over to these people, and he has this understanding of the way. But on the other hand, okay, Felix, as we're going to see, is someone who not just wants to keep the peace, but he wants to please the people he thinks he needs to please in order to keep that peace. So notice what happens, okay? He keeps listening to Paul. Look at 24. He keeps listening to Paul. He even brings his wife to listen to Paul. Felix says that he's going to summon Paul later. Look at verse 25. Now, why was he wanting to summon Paul later? I think he was generally intrigued in the message, but also there was some element of that he hoped that money would be given to him by Paul. Okay? So he hoped that at some point Paul would give him some money or something to me. I don't know if it's to get him out of there, to continue protecting him, or whatever. Okay. But when 2 years had elapsed, Felix is actually going to be succeeded by a man named Porcius Festus, and desiring to do the Jews a favor, he left Paul in prison. So when Felix had a chance to release Paul, he didn't, and this is kind of going to get kicked over to Festus, this new Roman governor. So we see Paul's witness to the governor was based on faith in Jesus. We read that earlier. It says that the Romans, and then we read the Romans governor interest in Paul and fear of the Jews. His interest was financial, and he wanted to please the Jews. It probably should say his primary interest was financial, and he desired to please the Jews. And so he leaves them there. And this then leads us now into chapter 25, where really we're just getting a setup for the next chapter. So as we look at 25, this chapter is a little bit different in the sense that I'm going to lay out almost like a mini outline of the main points of the chapter here on this slide. We're going to cover very little details from here other than an overview. This entire chapter really does set up this incredibly important chapter 26 that is coming up. It will be the second time that we see Paul giving his testimony of conversion, third time that it is given in the book of Acts. And it really encapsulates the gospel message, the purpose of ministry, etc. But that's chapter 26. So that'll be for the next lesson. But 25 really sets us up for that. So as we look here, if you look in verse 3, we have continued Jewish attempts to have Paul murdered. Continued Jewish attempts to have Paul murdered, continue in verse 3. If you look at verses 11 through 12, eventually Paul's just he's talking to Festus, this new governor, and eventually he just says, look, I appeal to Caesar. They want him to appear before the Sanhedrin again. He's like, look, I appeal to Caesar. Now, he's a Roman citizen. If a Roman citizen appeals to Caesar, then off to Caesar they go. And so it really puts Festus in a bind where Festus is like, well, okay, if that's what you want, then that's what you're going to get. Then in verses 13 through 22, before he's sent off to Caesar, the Jewish king of Judea arrives, a man named Herod Agrippa. He arrives, and he and Festus are going to discuss Paul. Festus is going to inform Agrippa about Paul, kind of explain the situation in the sense of what the accusations are against him. And then in 23 through 27, Paul actually appears before the Jewish king of Judea. Okay, so we get the beginning of this interaction that leads into 26. We get it at the end of 25. And then that leads us into 26, where even if you want to cheat and look ahead a little bit, 26 begins with, so Agrippa said to Paul, and then that kind of, it's initially a conversation, but then it really becomes a big speech by Paul about his conversion and the work of the Lord Jesus in his life. So again, as we look at the actual text, again, there's not a whole lot to highlight here. Again, verse 3, asking a favor against Paul. He summoned him to Jerusalem because they were planning an ambush to kill him on the way. So again, the Jews were planning to kill him. We covered that. As we continue through here, notice verse 12, really 11 and 12. This is Paul speaking. If then I am a wrongdoer and have committed anything to which I deserve to die, I do not seek to escape death. But if there's nothing to their charges against me, no one can give me up to them. So he said, look, you can't give me up to the Jews unless you can find me guilty. And he says, you know what? I appeal to Caesar. And when he had conferred with the council, so Festus basically told the council, listen, I'm just letting you know he appealed to Caesar. He answers him, to Caesar you have appealed, to Caesar you shall go. That's kind of his obligation as the Roman governor of the region. Right. Then we get Herod Agrippa showing up. This is Festus informing him. And then we get the end of the chapter, which leads us into chapter 26, okay, where we get this beginning of this interaction with Agrippa. His wife Bernice is there as well. And they present Paul to Agrippa. They kind of begin the conversation here, and that carries us into 26. So our next lesson, our final lesson in the book of Acts, will cover chapters 26, 27, and 28. I will tell you with a special heavy emphasis on chapter 26. So that being said, I pray you enjoyed that lesson and have a wonderful day.